what we'll prove for you is she engaged in an intentional act, driving back at him at that speed, in the storm, in the darkness, knowing that he had just gotten out of her Lexus. She intended that act.
John O'Keefe did not die from being hit by a vehicle, period. The facts will show that. The evidence will show that. The data will show that. The science will show that. And the experts will tell you that.
Hi, Crime Junkie jurors. We had a big day today in the second trial of Karen Read. Now, today is actually day one of trial. So we got to hear opening statements from both sides, and the first two witnesses were called to the stand. Plus, we had some more ARCA drama. So I wanted to give y'all a quick recap of what happened today, what you may have missed, and then give you some of my biggest takeaways from the day. So first up for the opening statements is prosecution. So prosecutor Hank Brennan gets up and he kind of paints this picture of a paramedic heading to 34 Fairview. He arrives, he hears a woman screaming, and he looks over and sees three women surrounding a man on the ground. Now, he describes blizzard conditions outside. There's this man on the ground showing no signs of life. And as they're trying to get information about this man or what's going on, Brennan says that Karen Read tells the paramedic, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Now, Brennan gives kind of an outline of what he says happened, including Karen Read's anger that was fueled by intoxication, as he says that she intentionally hit John O'Keefe with her car and then drove away. Now, Brennan's voice kind of softened a little bit as he began to talk about who John O'Keefe was as a person. Then he moved into his relationship with Karen Read. Also, during the openings, Brennan focused a lot on the data from John O'Keefe's phone and from Karen Read's car. So we'll definitely have to look out for more of that to come into evidence during the trial. I'm interested to see what all they have. When that's over, Alan Jackson is up for the defense. Now, Jackson gives some insight into what the defense's focus will be this time. He led by saying that there was no collision with John O'Keefe. And he says John O'Keefe did not die from being hit by a vehicle. He says the reason we ended up here is because of the now fired former trooper, Michael Proctor. He touches on the text thread from Michael Proctor, the one where he's asked, is the homeowner going to catch any shit? And Proctor says, nope, he's a Boston cop too. Jackson says that the investigation was flawed from the very start, and he gave his timeline of events. Now, Jackson also brought up the relationship of all of the people involved in this case and how the Alberts rehomed their dog Chloe that they had had for 7 years shortly after all of this happened. And not long after this incident, they actually sold their house that's been in their family for generations. Now, they also brought up that when the partygoers were leaving, not a single person actually saw John O'Keefe laying in the yard that night. Jackson spoke about Brian Higgins kind of briefly and how Higgins actually drove to Canton Police Department at 1 a.m. and made a phone call. And of course, he had to mention Jen McCabe's infamous Google search, "How long to die in the cold." Now, something else that Jackson brought up, he talks about the DNA that the prosecution has brought in, pointing out that there were actually 3 DNA profiles on the taillight, not just John O'Keefe's. And he says there were actually 5 male DNA profiles found on John O'Keefe's shoe. But the biggest bombshell in the defense's opening, Jackson says that there is a new medical expert that will testify that the injury to the back of John O'Keefe's head did not come from a flat surface like the ground, for example. And that unlike what we've heard from the prosecution, that John O'Keefe did not suffer from hypothermia, which they say suggests that he was actually injured in a warmer location and then moved outside to where he was found in the yard at 34 Fairview. Jackson says that alone is reasonable doubt. Now, after opening statements, the prosecution called their first witness, Timothy Nuttall from Canton Fire Department. They go over his background and training questions, and then Nuttall testified that he went to work a couple hours early because of the weather, and he describes the scene, what was happening, and the life-saving measures that were taken, and the injuries that he saw to John O'Keefe. But the big topic throughout Nuttall's testimony and his cross-examination, Nuttall says that while he was on the scene, he asked Karen Reed if she knew John O'Keefe. And Nuttall said that Karen Reed responded, quote, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And dash cam video is played where he describes what's happening. And he points out the moment to Hank Brennan where he says, "This is when Karen Reed said this to me." Jackson took the cross-examination for this one, and he began by asking Nuttall if and when he had met with the prosecution. He said that they had had 3 meetings, the first around 3 weeks ago, and then there was one last week, and then one the night before. Now, Jackson asks about these meetings being to coordinate what's being testified to. But on redirect, Brennan asks Nuttall about these meetings, and Nuttall says that Brennan had told him to just tell the truth, just to be honest. Now, there's a lot of back and forth about some of the topics they're talking about, but Jackson uses his chance at cross-examination to really show that Nuttall's testimony today was kind of different than what he testified to at the first trial. Like at the first trial, he said that Karen Reed said, "I hit him only twice." Also, Jackson asked Nuttall if Brennan pointed out that inconsistency when they were having these meetings or when they were talking. And Nuttall says, yes, he did during their meetings. But the biggest part of cross, Nuttall said that he specifically remembered his coworker, Tony Flamati, doing chest compressions on Officer O'Keefe at the time that Karen was telling him, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." So Jackson shows the dash cam video during cross-examination, and he kind of points out the time that you can see Flamati walking over to start the chest compressions, and he shows that Karen never approached during that time. Nuttall says it was before that clip, and Jackson kind of keeps pushing that time frame, pointing out that for that memory to be accurate, it would have to be when Flamati is doing the chest compressions, which is only in that video. So this part becomes a huge back and forth issue. It's brought up again on redirect with Brennan saying that the video that the defense showed is different because it doesn't have the timestamps. And he says it wasn't the full clip. Then Jackson says that the timestamps don't really matter because the clip that he showed has the entire time that Flamati is doing the chest compressions. So this whole thing goes back and forth a lot, to the point where NBC 10 correspondent Sue O'Connell said that one juror actually began laughing a little bit and kind of shaking his head up and down as Jackson tried again to get agreement from Nuttall about what was being said. Jackson also brought up some inconsistencies in Nuttall's memory from the last trial, like when he remembered a puffy jacket that he said John O'Keefe was wearing when there wasn't really a puffy jacket. Jackson's wanting to show the jury issues with his ability to recall details accurately in his memory. So Jackson then asked a few brief questions about Katie McLaughlin, a firefighter who Jackson says is friends with Brian Albert's daughter. And he wanted to know why Nuttall didn't mention her when he was first questioned. Jackson wondered if Nuttall had a debrief of the incident with his coworkers, including McLaughlin. And he said, well, they did, but Nuttall said these debriefs are mostly just kind of equipment oriented. So Jackson asked if they talked about the incident at all, but Nuttall said he really couldn't remember anything. He also asked some questions about the injuries to John O'Keefe's head. He wanted to know, were the eye injuries consistent with being punched in the face, for example? And Nuttall said, yeah, it could be. Now, when Nuttall was finished, Brennan showed a clip from the docuseries that was recently done on Karen Reed, where Karen Reed is kind of wondering if she really asked, did I hit him? or if it's just been told to her so many times by law enforcement that she just remembers this now because it's what she's been told. So with this being like the biggest topic that they kind of went back and forth about today, I'm really interested to see what the other first responders say, like what they remember and how their memories compare to what we heard today. So moving on, the prosecution then called their second witness, Miss Carrie Roberts. Now, Carrie Roberts is a friend of John O'Keefe's. So the testimony starts with kind of who she is. She lives in Canton. She's married with 2 kids. She went to high school with John O'Keefe, but they didn't really become friends until after his sister passed away, when John took in the kids and she kind of helped them. They lived in the same neighborhood and she helped him out with the kids. So Carrie gives her recollection of that morning about driving to Jim McCabe's and about going to John's house to search for him. And she recalled how frantic Karen Reed was when they pulled up to 34 Fairview. She said that she didn't see John at first, but Karen said that she did. And she started kicking the door, demanding to be let out. Carrie said that when Karen actually got out of the car, she looked at Jim McCabe and she said, "She's crazy." Now, Carrie's testimony was actually cut short today, but she will be back on the stand tomorrow. So we can get more into her testimony and everything that she remembers in tomorrow's recap. Now, the judge ended today around 3:45, but here are a few of my biggest takeaways from the day. I think that the new doctor testifying for the defense should be very, very interesting. Now, the defense says that forensic pathologist Dr. Elizabeth Lapisada will testify that the body of John O'Keefe showed no signs of hypothermia, and nothing on John O'Keefe's body was consistent with being hit by a car or a car accident. Like, for example, he didn't even have a bruise. Also, the injury to his scalp was from a raised ledge surface, not a flat lawn. And the injury to the back of his head was immediately incapacitating. So a lot of that stuff is brand new information. Also, the DNA evidence. First, according to Jackson, there's DNA from 5 unidentified males that was found on John O'Keefe's shoe. Now, that raises more questions. Could this DNA mean that John O'Keefe was injured somewhere else and had to be moved? Could this DNA mean that he was dragged by his feet, for example? Or could it have gotten on there some other way? Like, for example, if he rubbed his shoes on the dirty bar stool, or it was on there days before this night even happened. Could this DNA be from the paramedics on scene, who we know had to take his clothes off of him? Or was it even that shoe, or was it the other shoe? There's so many questions, so we'll have to pay attention to what comes out with this. Also, whose DNA, in addition to John O'Keefe's, was on the taillight? We know that there was DNA from 2 unidentified males. So will we find out who that belonged to? Also, Britton mentioned in openings that we will hear from Peggy O'Keefe, John's mom. Now, he talked about an interaction at the hospital between Mrs. O'Keefe and Karen. Now, this would also be brand new information. We didn't hear from her at all in the last trial, so I'm interested to see where that goes. There was also a quick motions hearing at the end of the day regarding the ARCA witnesses. Now, Brennan said that he watched unaired footage from the docuseries, and he says that he knows that there are more communications between ARCA and the defense that have not been turned over. Now, the defense is saying, yes, there are texts that no longer exist, but they say they turned over a summary of what those texts said. They said everything they have, they turned over, so there are no discovery issues. Now, the other issue regarding ARCA is that Brennan says he doesn't want any further opinions so late in the game from these defense experts, even though the Commonwealth's delay in sharing information with the defense is part of the reason why this has been so drawn out. So we'll find out more about that on Friday, because the judge has actually called for a voir dire this Friday for all of the ARCA witnesses without the jury being there. So we'll see what happens. Now, that's a wrap on opening statements and on day 1. So let me know what you think. What was your highlight of the day? What was the thing that stood out to you the most? What was it that you heard that you didn't know before, or that was brand new information to you? I want to hear everything that y'all thought. Let me know in comments. Also, I will be back tomorrow morning bright and early, 9 a.m., right here on Crime Junkie Jury for day 2. So come join me, and I will see y'all there.